Bright lights. Welcome. As Jeff said, I am Erica Schoder, our Streets Executive Director, and this is our Real Insights series live. So I'm so excited that you guys are here today. Normally, these conversations would be one-on-one and shared in writing, but we have a very special event today, and we want to let you listen in. So as Jeff introduced Jonah, I think he really needs no introduction to this crowd. He has been a fixture in our realm of ideas for many years, probably more than you want to remember. So Jonah, it's so nice that you're here today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Enough with the kind words, though. I come from a long line of Jews who think all compliments are bad luck. So,
so get on with the show.
And also, keep your expectations low.
Yeah.
You won't.
This is just a conversation.
Yeah.
Just a conversation. So you live a very vibrant public intellectual life, but I also know that you are an introvert. Maybe that's a bit of an understatement. I don't know how much. But how do you sort of resist the pull of wanting to be home with a good book, having dinner with your wife, hang out with all of your dogs, and needing to be in public here with us today?
I mean, introvert is maybe not the right word. Misanthrope kind of works. It's funny. I've probably written 200 pieces from the front seat of my car, where I go park in a garage, semi-open garage by my Safeway and smoke cigars and write. And it wasn't until everyone used to say, "Look at that freak," and then COVID hit, and all of a sudden I was this responsible social distancer. Look, I like arguments. And I think democracy is built on arguments. Democracy is about disagreement, not about agreement. And I think one of the defining strengths of whatever you want to call it, the conservative movement, the right, the fusionist right, whatever, has been its willingness to have internal arguments. And one of the reasons why I think it's gotten itself in trouble is because we have sort of a popular front attitude defining a lot of the right these days, where arguments are no longer encouraged. And I think debating amongst yourselves is one of the great strengths of the American right for the last half century. And I like being part of all that stuff. But part of it is just like I've curated my life to the point where I don't have to do a lot of the things I don't want to do. I mean, I still have to do TV, which I do not like. And it was one thing. It was really cool in the 90s and the early 2000s when, it helps you meet girls and stuff. But like that's no longer the issue. And the arguments that you have on TV are kind of stupid. And that's true. This is not a slight against CNN. I think CNN's a little better in some ways than some of the other networks, but it's intellectually not very nutritious. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I don't have a great answer to the question of like, why am I so weird and yet so involved? Why you dislike the humans so much and yet you interact with them so much? It's just, this is the life I've chosen.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about you. And maybe your dogs. Uh-huh. So how did you end up with so many, and what's up with that?
I don't have so many, but I only have the two right now, and I used to have 2 cats. Now we have 1 cat, and we are going through everything imaginable to keep this cat alive because my daughter has invested all of her fond childhood memories in this fur-bearing quadruped, and no, but I like dogs. I've leaned into this persona about dogs. I think dogs are good. And one of the things I like about dogs is they are a completely apolitical zone of your life. Like, my dogs do not care if my books sell well. They do not care if I'm wrong about trade policy. And I'm not wrong about trade policy, by the way. And they are, my friend Arthur Brooks, one of the points he makes about happiness is that there are only about 5 or 6 sources of happiness, according to social scientists and psychologists who study this stuff. And it's basically faith, family, friends, experiences. Genes is a big one because some people are just born miserable bastards. And, and another one is this concept of earned success. And but a big part of earned success is this, it's not necessarily making the most money or being the most famous, it's feeling needed. Feeling like if you were gone, you'd be missed, that you make some sort of special contribution in the world. And there's no creature, I mean, like Robin Williams used to have this great line where he used to say in the 80s, I wish they would make sex an Olympic sport just to see what the East Germans come up with. Dogs were basically designed by those kinds of scientists to need you. And every time you come home, they're there, they're happy. They don't care what kind of day you had or didn't have. And so I love dogs.
Okay. So along those lines, it sounds like you know your conception of the good life. And I was going to ask, if you look back, would you say that was a life well lived and that you had enough of this sort of someone who needed you or a dog who needed you?
Look, I mean, I think everybody, I have some very, very good friends. No one ever thinks, gosh, I had too many good friends, right? So like, yeah, I mean, I feel like I've made a contribution. I have one of the few jobs where, like my friend Tim Carney's got this great bit, it's very R Street point, about how he can't stand it when really rich people talk about how now that they've made a lot of money, they want to give back. And he uses the example of the guy who invented the cronut. And so this guy made a fortune off of a cronut, which is a croissant donut hybrid thing, deep fried, it's delicious. And his whole point is, it's a very sort of Leonard Read kind of point, is this, look, you don't have to give back. You gave us the cronut. But like, there are a lot of things where people make meaningful contributions in a capitalist society where they don't, the only way to feel like you recognize the contribution is the money you make. Right. I have the kind of position, I wish I made more money, but like, I hear from a lot of people about how much the Dispatch means to them, or how much this book meant to them, how much the GFO or the Remnant or these other things that I do. And it's nice to know that you made a mark somewhere. That, you know, because I write, a lot of the stuff I write as if I was writing a note and putting it in a bottle and throwing it out into the ocean. And I always kind of freaked out when people respond to me that they actually read it. And that's sort of part of the gimmick of being able to write as much as I do, is not thinking about like the audience per se, just thinking about what you want to get on the page. And so I like what I do for a living. I like writing. I consider myself a writer, not a speaker, not a TV person, not any of those other things. I like writing, and one of the tricks in life is whatever it is figuring out what's the thing that you would want to do even if you weren't that well compensated for it. And writing for me is that thing.
Okay. So how do you figure out what to pay attention to?
That's hard. Yeah. That's really, really hard. And I will say I struggle these days because for most of my adult life, I was basically, most of my professional life, I've been a conservative in good standing to one extent or another on the right. And the things that I wanted to write about were consistent with where broadly speaking, the right was. And part of the problem is that, you know, the way I develop muscle memory to write is there's certain sort of tricks, you know, and they're not cheating. It's the way you get yourself out of bed to do these things. And one of them is, you know, I'll put it this way: when George Will got his column in the early 70s for the Washington Post, he called Bill Buckley and said, how the hell am I going to write 2 columns a week? And Bill said, oh, that's easy. At least 2 things a week will annoy you. Write about those. And it's true. Like, the things that I write about tend to be where I hear a bad argument, and then I want to respond to it. And that's how I get the juices flowing, that kind of thing. And these days, I'm in ill odor with many people on the right because the arguments that annoy me the most come from my own side. And the expectation is, no, I'm supposed to keep picking fights with the left. Happy to pick fights with the left. But I'm not going to avoid picking fights with the right when I think there are people who are allegedly on my side or doing real damage to the ideas and principles that informed my arguments with the left. You know, I mean, like protectionism, the idea that somehow I'm supposed to be, I've been yelling at the left about how protectionism is stupid for 25 years, and now I'm supposed to think it's great just because one guy in the White House thinks it's great. Like, that's not how I operate. It is how a lot of other people operate.
Okay. So let's move from the soul of Jonah Goldberg to the soul of the nation. You have said that.
It's a big leap.
It's a big leap. The Achilles heel of liberal democratic capitalism is that it doesn't fill the hole in your soul. It merely creates opportunities for you to find something that will. Right. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the pursuit of happiness is an individual right, but it is realized for most people collectively. That's how we're wired, right? As we find a group, an institution, a family, a tribe, a community, virtual or otherwise, that we're at home in and that we get some of that earned success in. And the great failure of, the great error of politics going back, carry the one, 250,000 years, is the idea that you can create a political system that will give you that sense of belonging, that sense of, you know, what Robert Nisbet calls this quest for community. And I used to give these talks all the time to right-wing groups about how the categorical error in a lot of politics is a mistake that libertarians never make, that conservatives sometimes make, and that the left considers at the heart of their political philosophy. And it's just simply this: the government cannot love you. It cannot be your mommy or your daddy. It cannot give you meaning. It can improve your net worth, but it can't improve your self-worth. That's something you get from actual human beings. And so the problem with liberal democratic capitalism, and I want to be really clear about this, what has two thumbs and loves liberal democratic capitalism? This guy. But people, any argument against liberal democratic capitalism going back the last 300 years or so, because that's basically how old it is, it's always this error. It is always this thing about how it served its purpose, or it doesn't satisfy your spiritual needs or your communal needs. We need to answer the social question, as they put in the 19th century. Socialism, nationalism, fascism, communism, all of these things, I would argue, are reactionary because they are just different forms of tribalism. Tribalism, you know, communism is tribalism by class, fascism is, or Nazism is tribalism by race. You can go down the list. And what liberal democratic, so the critics of liberal democratic capitalism going back a few centuries, they always say we need a more cooperative system, right? This is like Woodrow Wilson's thing about how we need to evolve past the Newtonian constitutional system and have a more Darwinian one, where everybody works in cooperatively and communally together, right? It's this spirit of, if we all work our hardest and try our best, we can make this the best yearbook ever, right? And that's what they want to get from politics. You can't get that from government. You can get that from working in campaigns. I know lots of people who just love campaigns because it's that sense of we're just going and it's a team and it's all that kind of stuff. But you can't get it from government. And the thing that's so annoying about that argument is that, in fact, liberal democratic capitalism is the most cooperative system ever created. The problem is it's so good at it, it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel cooperative, right? I mean, one of the canonical essays of this stuff is I Pencil, you know, and Leonard Read points out that nobody knows how to make a pencil. You have all these people of different races, different faiths, in different countries, different political systems, different histories, different cultures, different languages, working cooperatively around the world to produce a pencil that costs a couple pennies. And that's what liberal democratic capitalism can do, but because it's so pure in its cooperativeness, it doesn't feel cooperative. And so what people try to do is come up with systems that are actually less efficient, that don't generate wealth, but feel cooperative. And that's what the nationalists want to do. It's what the post-liberals want to do. It's what the left has always wanted to do. It's what the socialists want to do. It's to create a politics that gets that team spirit. And I'll close on the rant with, Friedrich Hayek has this distinction between the microcosm and the macrocosm. And in the microcosm is friends and family, community, the people you know by name, right? There's this thing in sociology called Dunbar's number, which says that we are actually only evolved to only know about 150 people as human beings, as actual people. And the rest, they become abstractions. And so for Hayek, the microcosm is for, just as an example, is your family. And your family is not a democratic or capitalistic institution, right? I always tell people, in your family, you're much closer to communism, right? We are Marxists in our family. It is from each according to their ability to each according to their need. If you have two kids and one kid is kind of dumb and, just not that all impressive, and the other kid's really great, you don't feed the great kid better food, right? You don't put price tags on all the stuff in your fridge for your kids, right? It's a different moral order. But in the extended order, in the macrocosm, what the German social scientists call the Gesellschaft, you have contracts, you have rules, you charge people for things, right? Because that's how you deal with strangers. And one of the fundamental insights from Hayek is that you will destroy the microcosm if you try to make it part of the macrocosm. And you will make the macrocosm tyrannical if you try to make it operate like the microcosm. If you try to make the president your father, if you try to make the government your family, you will ruin that system that liberal democratic capitalism maintains. You need this dualism of, in the microcosm, there's one set of rules and expectations, and in the macrocosm, there's another set of rules.
Okay. So where should people find belonging and meaning? Because clearly people are searching, and they're finding it in sort of nationalism, this romantic nationalism on the one hand, and then this sort of identitarian excess on the other.
Yeah. So, how to put this? So first of all, if you wanted to make me czar for a little while, as Tom Friedman might call it, czar for a day, I would sort of try to invert the political structure of the United States to a great degree, by which I mean send as much power down to the most local levels possible. Federalism, I used to do this for college students, is actually the best system ever conceived of for maximizing human happiness, because it lets the most people live the way they want to live. And it's mathematically the case. And so one of the benefits you would get from that is that you'd still have culture war fights in Peoria, right? You still have disagreements. You still have politics, because politics is natural. But the winners would have to look the losers in the eye, right? You'd see them at your kids' soccer games. You'd see them at the grocery store. Also, the powers that be would have names, and you could fire them if they screwed up. When you put all this power in Washington, everyone becomes an abstraction. It becomes the system, right, and the establishment and all this kind of stuff. And there's nobody to assign blame to, and it makes people feel like they don't have agency in their lives. So that's, in terms of political program, that's where I would start. Beyond that, we have a huge problem about the erosion. Forget faith and trust in institutions. It's just the erosion of institutions. And the previous speaker was talking about it a little bit. The bowling alone thesis is true. And I think that one of the reasons for it is that we live most of our lives, certainly our political lives, and a lot of other parts of our lives, intermediated through screens, either on our phones or on our TVs or on our tablets or our computers and all that kind of stuff. And that makes it easier and easier to see people you disagree with as abstract others, right? And it also allows you to create associations that are very thin, and often one-dimensional. Identity politics is one, this nationalism thing is another. I mean, a lot of them are like that. And part of my problem with all that is it treats human beings not just as abstractions, but as essentially commodities, right? Just listen to the debate about illegal immigrants in this country. Now, I'm for doing a lot of things with immigration and all that kind of stuff. I'm generally pro-immigration, but you got to have rules. When people ask me what my preferred immigration policy is, I always say to have one. But you listen to people, you listen to the arguments about illegal immigrant criminals, and there's some really horrendous illegal immigrant criminals. But just because person A is a horrible criminal doesn't mean that person B, who fits the same category as illegal immigrant, is a murderer and a rapist too. There's no transitive property to this kind of stuff. And yet, that's what racism is. It's assuming if you know one black person, you know all black people. If you know one Jew, you know all Jews, right? And I guess what's worse, the worst forms of racism or anti-Semitism are when you actually don't know any of them, you just know the caricature that you get through some screen or something like that, and you make these sweeping assertions that these people are not individuals and all that kind of stuff. And so I personally believe that the fight for liberty begins in your backyard, but also the fight for a meaningful life begins in your backyard with people you actually know as people that need you and like you, and that you see your reflections of the best versions of yourself in how they see you. And so I'm for radical decentralization of like a lot of politics, which would mean some decentralization in economics, and Shoshana would yell at me because some place is doing bad zoning somewhere, and so be it. That's a price I'm willing to pay.
Great. All right, so let's talk about utopias, because I know you love them, right? Is that right? So you have counseled against utopian thinking, and there's a phrase that I have never uttered out loud, but you've said a couple times, emanetize the eschaton, is that right?
Yeah.
So can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. So this gets back to sort of conservative eggheadery, not 101, but more seminar level. Eric Vogelin is this political philosopher, very hard to read. It feels like Google Translate messed up when you read him. And he had this concept of immanentizing the eschaton. And this is basically this idea of so the eschaton is basically, like eschatology. It's like what is about the end of things, the hereafter, right? And part of the problem with political religions, which, his ideas on this evolve, but for our purposes, we'll just hold it constant. Political religions are these utopian political movements, Nazism, communism, Bolshevism, all that kind of stuff, that try to create a heaven on earth. The progressives talk about this openly all the time. They talk about how we're going to create a kingdom of heaven on earth. That's another way of saying utopia, right? Because in heaven, everything's great. That's so I hear. And everyone gets beachfront property. And the problem with that sort of thinking is that, so what immanentizing the eschaton means is trying to make the here and now like what is reserved for the hereafter, right? So it's utopianism. It's trying to make a perfect society. And the problem, as conservatives will point out, and most libertarians, is that you can't make a perfect society. Scarcity is part of the fundament of reality. Even if we come up with cold fusion and Star Trek replicators and we can do 3D printing of anything that we want in the world, you still have the scarcity of time. And time spent doing X means time not spent doing Y. And so the part of the problem so first of all, utopianism doesn't work, right? Thomas More coined the phrase, it's a neologism combining Greek and Latin, and it literally means no place. And it was supposed to be satire. But the arguments I've had with the left for most of my professional life, which I'm now having to have every now and then with the right, is this idea that you actually can create a perfect society, that you can wring out all the contradictions in life. And you can't, because human nature doesn't change. We are all built from the crooked timber of humanity, and it will never be made straight. And people want different things. The pursuit of happiness being an individual right means that some people's definition of the perfect life, of a great life, is people's idea of hell. There are people who get nothing but meaning and a sense of fulfillment from being in the Marines. And then there are people who would be utterly miserable as Marines. There's nothing wrong with either position, right? It's just that people are different. And so what inevitably happens when you try to achieve a utopia is you end up starting to treat people like abstractions, that they're commodifiable and interchangeable, and you start to try to force every square peg into the round hole of your plan. And this is, again, why I'm a Hayekian, is that, like, decent societies emerge organically with spontaneous order, where people do trial and error, and they figure stuff out, and they create institutions that respond to people's needs, and you can't do that from some centralized place in Washington. You can't, like, Charles Murray used to ask people, do any of you in the audience think that the government has a better idea about how you should live than you do? And I think that that's a good way to think about some of these things. And utopianism, by definition, has to treat a nation of individuals and of families and of different cultures and different communities and different philosophies and different religions and different tastes as essentially a piece of clay that they can mold into any shape that they want. And the other fundamental problem with utopianism is that once you believe it's true, that you can make a perfect society, then you give yourself permission to do anything required to get it, right? Suicide bombers are suicide bombers because they get paradise. People who think that they can deliver utopian bliss for all eternity, well, what's a few cracked skulls compared to that, right? And so you start giving yourself permission for radicalism in pursuit of something that is unachievable.
Yeah. So is the phenomenon that we see now, the sort of so many people wanting to burn everything down, is that about utopianism, or is that something else?
I think it's related, right? It's more about the stuff we were talking about before. I think there's a real hunger for meaning in society, and that's partly a sign of the erosion of our institutions, is that they're not getting that hunger satisfied, that hole in their soul filled by the places that can fill it. Friends, family, faith, community, and that kind of stuff. And so they are very susceptible to a pitch from people saying, you can get that from this movement, right? Whether it's nationalism or socialism or any other thing. And you can't, right? You can't get that. But that desire for meaning, that desire for belonging, that desire for recognition, what the Greeks called thymos or thumos or whatever, is inherent in human nature. And so you have a bunch of people, particularly young men, who don't feel respected, right? Don't feel like they have a way of making a meaningful contribution, who get sold this stuff, and it fills them up with a sense of purpose and meaning, and they don't understand that, like, the end goal of it isn't, they're not going to get what they've been told they're going to get from it. And which is, again, another reason why pushing power down to the most local level possible gives people an opportunity for achievable results. I mean, this is one, I don't want to get too deep into my internecine squabbles on the right stuff, but like a lot of the nationalists are the post-liberal common good conservatives, right, who want to have Aristotelian idea of a perfect society, they always want to start with the entire federal government and the entire United States of America. And I was like, why don't you start with Rhode Island? Like, pick take a smaller bite and, like, create this perfect society that will then be a model for how to, like, export the idea. And they never want to do that because a lot of it is more about power than it's actually about the ideas they profess.
Okay. Since you brought it up, let's talk about the C word, conservative. Mm-hmm. Tell us what's going on. I know you've been a conservative for a long time. How did we get here? Maybe a little diagnosis of what's going on?
Yeah. So, I mean, enough with the philosophy stuff. Just very basically, one of the reasons why we got here was that conservatives or the right generally, overpromised and underdelivered on a whole bunch of fronts. And then opportunistic people said, see, this is why you can't trust the establishment. You have to go with us. And then, but those people overpromised and underdelivered as well. My old friend Andrew Breitbart always used to say, politics is downstream of culture. This stuff about distrust in institutions and loss of meaning, it's not just a conservative problem or a liberal problem. It's an American problem, and it manifests itself differently in different places. And so I think it's too long a topic to get too deep in the weeds on, but part of the problem is that there are still gatekeepers on the right, but the problem is that, when you think about the phrase gatekeeper, what does that mean? It means like two guards in front of a gate, and what's around the gate is a wall, right? Well, if the walls have all been knocked down, who gives a rat's ass about the gate, right? And social media, the internet, all of these things basically blocked or eradicated the ability of responsible people to gatekeep, to edit, in a certain sense, stuff, and it opened the door for just a robust, monetizable business model of pandering to people's worst instincts. And so we were going to get populism after the financial crisis no matter what, but in an environment of social media and that kind of thing, it's so much easier to what we at the Dispatch call monetize dopamine hits, to just make people angry on social media and tell them that all of their problems could be solved if those people just got out of the way.
We don't have much time. I was going to ask you a couple of questions, so we'll make this quick. We play this game every year when we get together at our street. It's called Unpopular Opinions. Have you ever seen it on BBC One?
I have not.
Okay. Well, basically, you give me your unpopular opinion and sort of defend it in a couple of sentences, and then people rebut it, but we're not going to do that today. Maybe at the happy hour, they can rebut it. So, but any unpopular opinion, think about this heterodox crowd.
Sure. Okay, and got to do it quick. So as Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. I have a lot of unpopular opinions, but I guess the one that's relevant for here is I think almost everybody talks about democracy wrong, that democracy is really important, but it's not important for the reasons that people think. People like to talk about democracy leading to best outcomes, right? Some people are actually utopian about it. If we could just figure out a way to get the will of the people, Elon Musk likes to say vox populi, vox dei, which is sand-poundingly stupid and theologically heretical, right? And it's like the voice of God is not the voice of the people, at least not according to the Old Testament, I'm pretty sure, right? If it was, then Sodom and Gomorrah would still be standing, right? But the thing about democracy that makes democracy great is not that it leads to best outcomes. The thing about democracy that makes democracy indispensable is that it's a hedge against worst outcomes. It makes it possible to fire people. And that's the Madisonian vision, which says that this is an era before polling existed. So the way you did polling was you had elections. And congressmen got fired if they were doing bad things. It didn't mean that the next congressman was necessarily going to be better, but at least they were afraid of being fired. And so democracy, beyond the ability to fire people, is not morally superior to any other political system. It just allows us to prevent morally inferior systems from gaining hold. Democracy by itself is simply the doctrine that says 51% of the people get to pee in the cornflakes of 49% of the people. Nothing else.
Okay, thank you for your unpopular opinion. Last question, because we have to leave on a note of credible optimism. Mm-hmm. So what gives you hope that in 250 years from now, Americans will still be living in freedom and having conversations like we've had at the Real Solutions Summit? And what would you want our descendants in 2276 to say about how we rose to the challenges of our time?
Good golly. Okay, so
Incredible optimism.
In 30 seconds or less. Okay,
Yes.
no. So like I've for 25 years I've been telling audiences that be happy warriors, because liberal democratic capitalism is not only the best anti-poverty program ever created, it's the only anti-poverty program ever created. And for 250,000 years, the average human being everywhere in the world lived on no more than $3 a day. And that changed once and only once, and it's because of liberal democratic capitalism. And so part of why I have hope is I used to tell audiences, be a happy warrior, because the majority will always get politics wrong for this problem because they want government to love them. And that means every generation you're going to have these fights. And that's all you can ever really do, is have the fight in your generation and try to bequeath to the next generation something to be grateful for. And another lesson of that is that if we're right, and I think we are right, I'm including all of you in this for the sake of argument, if we're basically right about liberal democratic capitalism, then the people proposing something else are wrong. And if they're wrong, in the fullness of time, reality will prove that. So have some conviction and some faith that you're going to be proven right in the long run. And Edmund Burke says, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other. And what Burke meant by that was basically you have to show people. People have to actually see it for themselves. I was listening to Econ Talk recently, and Russ Roberts was saying how when he interviewed Milton Friedman 15 years ago, he said, Russ was taking credit about how economists persuaded everybody that price controls were bad. And Friedman said, no, we didn't. Economists didn't do any such thing. You know what persuaded people price controls were bad? Price controls. Because they didn't like price controls, and they didn't like long lines at the gas station, and so they got rid of price controls. Those things are going to happen over and over again. As Ed Koch, who I don't normally say did anything better than Edmund Burke, or Milton Friedman, but when he lost his bid for a third term as mayor of New York City, he was asked if he was ever going to run again. And he said, no, the people of New York fired me, and now they must be punished. That's part of democracy, is the punishment part. And I think the people who get this stuff wrong are going to get punished. The question is how much damage is going to be done before the people punish politicians for screwing things up. But I think our ideas are right. I think they'll be proven right again and again over time. It just depends how long we stray from believing the evidence in front of us before we recommit to those principles. But I have every confidence that we will, because this is a good and decent country with good and decent people in it. And as how I want us to be remembered, I resent that the times have made me feel like I am obliged to be like this, upstanding guy who teaches integrity and principles and all that kind of stuff. I much preferred my life when I was the funny guy who really tested the limits of propriety. I liked being the guy who got a call from my editor saying, maybe you shouldn't say that every time Alan Dershowitz takes Viagra, he gets taller. And so I kind of resent being put in this position. But that said, the one thing I think we'll rise to the occasion eventually, right? In the Churchillian way of we'll keep screwing it up until we realize the right answer was in front of us all along. But the line that has been sticking with me for a while now comes from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he says, you can resolve to live your life with integrity. Let your credo be this. Let the lie come into the world. Let it even triumph, but not through me. And I have no illusions about my ability to persuade vast numbers of people about my positions. All I know I can do is not lie, not write or say things I don't believe to be true. And I think if people just stuck with that basic rule, we would be in much better shape than we are right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for, yes, round of applause.